Greetings, friends. Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update for the week of January 22nd to 28th of 2024. And this week we have some updates. So let us begin. First, we're going to start in Avdiivka. So last week we discussed about the Russian breakthrough in the southern part of Avdiivka, and now we're going to talk about what has come about because of that breakthrough. So right now, what happened this week was that this week, and the Russians took full control over these three streets: Subornia Street, Chernovsky Street, and Sportorna Street, these streets right here. The Ukrainians, however, are launching counterattacks. There was clashes on these edges. There was geolocated footage of a Ukrainian attack bombarding this area right here. And then before pulling back. So the Ukrainians are now on the attack. The Russians took the Tsar's hut right here and basically broke through to this area right here. And so now the Ukrainians have been continuously launching counterattacks to try to recapture this area, because if they let the Russians consolidate here, then it's just residential area, and this is very less likely to be, it's less defendable, let's just say. But however, all those attacks have failed, but they have slowed down the Russians a bit. So right now, I think the Ukrainians have given up on trying to recapture this and have instead are trying to slow down the Russians to reestablish a new temporary defense line. What a lot of sources are saying is that the Ukrainians are using on the left flank the 9th district here, the high-rise buildings. This is one of the most fortified areas of Avdiivka, along with the coke plant. So this area is not going to get stormed anytime soon. Kind of in front of these forest line right here in this 9th district. But also the new line of defense for the residential area kind of goes along these main little buildings. This Avdiivka little hospital for the TB dispensary, the tuberculosis, and all the way to the cemetery, the church, and this little school. So this kind of area with some they have some big buildings here. They're not big buildings, they're not like high rises, but they are bigger than just like a one-story house. So this kind of gives the Ukrainians a way to establish some sort of temporary defense line so that the Russians don't just break through here and enter the residential area of Avdiivka. So they're trying to establish this front line as they're continuously doing counterattacks, but this area right here is going to be given up because of the advancements in the industrial area and now in this broken through area from the Tsar's hut. So and as a consequence of breaking through the Tsar's hut here, and the failure of the Ukrainians to recapture this, the Ukrainians are doing a slow withdrawal from another key strong point. So, this pre-war front line that held Avdiivka was held by the industrial zone, the Tsar's hut, the filtration system, and what they call the ex-air defense base right here. And because of the breakthrough right here, and since the Russians are also on this side right here, as you can see from a topside view, the Russians are basically almost going to encircle this tiny pocket. And so basically, since the supply of this grouping in the southern parts of Avdiivka here is going to be cut off, the Ukrainians are withdrawing from the ex-air defense base, which was a thorn on Russia's side. And as I mentioned, they're going to be retreating back here to the 9th district to hold back the Russians from taking any more of Avdiivka. But because they broke through the Tsar's hut, the Russians have been able to occupy this ex-air defense base right here. You could actually see the trenches and everything. And now they are the Ukrainians are going to be backing out of this other strong point right here. This is another strong point the Ukrainians have. It is kind of part of the ex-air defense base, kind of part of the same strong point network. But again, this is also in trouble of getting supplied. So they're just slowly pulling back here, and before they withdraw to the 9th district. So the Russians are basically consolidating their gains in the Tsar's hut and in this area. And according to some, there was some sort of the way they broke through was that they took there was this underwater or underground pipe that they somehow were able to, that got them right behind enemy lines, which basically collapsed the lines immediately. So that was kind of an interesting operation. So anyway, so that's they've basically been able to actually keep these gains and push the take these three streets and now force the Ukrainians out of the ex-air defense base. So now the Ukrainians are trying to, they're not going to give up just yet. They lost some of their main defense points, but that doesn't mean they're going to give up Avdiivka just yet. So They still have the filtration system to guard their right flank. They still have positions, up north in the coke plant, and they're trying to make a temporary line to deflect any more Russian attacks. So the Battle of Avdiivka is not over; it will continue, but the Russians had a lot of gains in the south of Avdiivka and have consolidated. No movements in the north really, after the small advance from Kamyanka. So clashes are still going on in Stepova, but no real big changes on this front for this week. The Ukrainians are basically trying to eliminate this bridgehead. There's some rumors that they're trying to basically push the Russians back to this rail line, because after the Russians failed to basically take Stepova and Berdichi and create continue their encirclement, then this is, if they're not going to encircle Avdiivka, then this area right here is not really necessary, but they do need to keep their lines along this rail line, because this is a really good defense point to prevent the Ukrainians from entering Krasnogorivka here. So this town right here is critical to holding because the Ukrainians need to take back the Terrakon, this dominant height, this dominant waste heap, and this town in order to break the encirclement of Avdiivka from the north. But so far, nothing actually changed this week, but besides the south. We're now actually going to go beyond Avdiivka. Actually, since we're on the Donetsk front in general, let me just continue talking about the Donetsk front. Along with this is kind of the Russians have made gains in Peremyska in the south here. The reason in this the southern part of Peremyska right here, the reason being is that since the Russians are basically on this, they've been able to advance in the north of Peremyska. This basically allows them flanking attacks to Peremyska. So Ukrainian troops all the way to the south here could not continue holding their positions and are slowly withdrawing to this area right here. And so the Russians are going to take this like house to house, and the main Ukrainian position is in the center of Peremyska right here. So the Russians will hold the southern part of Peremyska, you could say maybe the northern, what's the right word? Like the more western part of Peremyska is under full Ukrainian control, and then kind of like the eastern central part of Peremyska is a gray zone. Not a gray zone, but just like where the fighting will be going back and forth. Peremyska, what's the purpose of it? There's twofold. First, again, the whole point of this operation is to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. So right now, Ukrainian artillery might be in Netolova here, and Ukrainian troops are in Peremyska. And, Ukrainian artillery being here allows them to still shell Donetsk. However, they take Peremyska and push the Ukrainians, say, back to this village, and the Ukrainian artillery will have to be pushed back a little bit further back to maybe behind the Volchachka River here. And then if the Ukrainian artillery is here, then with just conventional artillery, they won't be able to actually reach Donetsk city. They might reach maybe, the suburbs, but not the city itself. So Peremyska needs to be captured for the whole purpose, for the same reason why they're taking Avdiivka and Marinka. But there's also a secondary reason, is because Peremyska is a little bit of a stab in the Russian offensive in the south. So if the Russians want to continue holding the southern part of Avdiivka, as they try to take Avdiivka, they need to hold Peremyska, and the more they hold Peremyska, the bigger buffer zone they have to continue their offensive and either encircling Avdiivka from the south, or basically trying to encircle Avdiivka from the south. So that's the two reasons for trying to take Peremyska. So there were some gains in the southern part of Peremyska, but that these are small gains as we are expecting in this war. No changes on the other parts of the Donetsk front. Marinka is still the same and such. So let us go to actually the next place of the most interesting things to talk about, which is I call the Luhansk front right here, or the Oskol front. This area is kind of split between the Liman and Kupinsk fronts here, but people kind of split these fronts in two. I kind of put this under the same, because both these areas have the same operational goals, which is to reach the Oskol River, but they both, you could kind of split in half if you want to. So, but in the northern part of this Luhansk front is actually where a lot of gains have been made this week. So As we mentioned last week, the Russians took the village of Krotomolona here after a surprise offensive here. And after basically taking this village, the Russians have expanded upon their success this week. They launched another major offensive operation and managed to take and capture the village of Tabivka here. And basically took also the hills to the west of it here. And so that's another village that got captured in this area. And they also expanded the bridge to the south of Kromolona here and are now reaching the outskirts of the village of Berestova here. So, and after the fall of Tabivka, the Ukrainians have retreated to Pishana here. And, you can see Pishana here. They have like a lot of places where they can have good defense points here. But again, this area is, the Ukrainians have troops in Kupiansk here, and they've been holding the Russian advance here for months. They also had troops here because this prevents the Russians from breaking through the south. And that's why the Russians have not been able to take the Klishchivka, Krotolovka village defense points here. However, in the south, kind of in the south area right here, the Ukrainians are like, well, we're not going to have as much defense lines in the south of this area because, we only have so much manpower, and there's only so much places we could defend. Let's defend the most critical points. This is why, for example, as you remember a few months ago, the Russians attacked here and managed to enter, start attacking for these villages right here, because no one was guarding this area right here, and they were guarding, in the south right here, or they were near Lamad, or they were guarding near Kupiansk. But in these little villages in between those places, there's not really much defense. So the Russians exploited that and are now gouging into the Ukrainian defenses here. As we can see here, because of the capture of Tabivka and Kromona here, the Ukrainian defenses in Klishchivka, Krotolovka are now critical. They've been trying to outflank it from the north here, but the Ukrainians have been successfully holding them back in Ivanivka. However, because of the capture of Tabivka and Kromona here, now the Russians are putting pressure on the southern part of this village defense line here. And basically, I would not be surprised if, as long as they hold their progress here, the Russians are able to outflank the Ukrainians here, and this area collapses. Because if this area collapses, basically it's just open fields basically until the Oskol River here, and then they'll push across these open fields, reach these tiny villages here, and once they capture these villages and kind of have this and split this front in the north from the front in the south, then they could begin the assault on Kupiansk from the south. Now, not Kupiansk itself. I define Kupiansk by not only the city, but also its suburbs. Like, this is a suburb of Kupiansk. Technically, this is a different town, but it's part of, kind of the Kupiansk city borders. And so, reaching these right here will allow them to start attacking the Kupiansk suburbs from the south. There's also been attacks of the Russians renewed their assaults on Simkovka here, and it looks like the Russians are trying to have re-enter the northern part of Simkovka. However, again, this is just, the Russians have been trying to take this village for months now, and it's been I don't know why they've not been able to take it, but again, they need to take this village in order to start assaulting Kupiansk from the north. So, lots of clashes. We'll see if this offensive actually gains stuff. But again, there's a lot of promising stuff coming from the south here as the Russians continue building upon their success in the south. And if they're able to hold this and expand it, this gives them a step closer to reaching their goal of taking Kupiansk. No changes on the Liman front per se. The Russian offensive on trying to reach the Zhierbets River has slowed down after the arrival of Ukrainian reinforcements. Again, they could reinforce. They just can't reinforce every single part of the line if everywhere gets attacked. And so, as you can see, they're like, oh, we really need to prevent the Russians from reaching Liman, so we're going to send our reserves here. But when the Russians attack these two villages, and they're like, well, they can't reinforce every single part. So they could reinforce, but not everywhere. So they have to pick and choose. And so, since the Russians are attacking everywhere, it's very hard to reinforce every single part. But no changes on the Liman front. Let's talk about the Bakhmut-Seversk front here now. So, in the Seversk front, as we mentioned last week, the Russians are also on the offensive here. They took Vasola and continued their offensive up along the rail line. Nothing changed there. However, there's been some changes on the Bilogorivka front. This front has been kind of static for almost a year. And so the Russians actually did a small offensive operation to the north of Bilogorivka and managed to take this filtration system right here. Again, it's all destroyed. You can see it right here. The Russians are also advancing to try to occupy this industrial zone right here. But as you can see in this area, this village is completely reduced to ruins. There's nothing left here. It has been completely destroyed. But the Ukrainians need to hold this because it kind of puts, it's an outpost to prevent the Russians from advancing along this riverbed and preventing the Ukrainians from, because the Ukrainians have this complex defense network in the Seversky Donetsk forest here, right here. And the loss of this forest will basically open up the lines to Liman, and they need to hold these trenches in order to prevent the Russians from advancing on Liman. So that's why they need to prevent the Russians from outflanking the forest from the south. And that's where Bilogorivka comes in. So, yeah, and it's also one of the key villages to prevent the Russians from attacking Seversk directly. So, this is, it's been very hard for the Russians to advance here. They have not been able to take it. It's because the Ukrainians are not necessarily in the village. They're in these heights behind the village. And you can actually see all the little artillery shots here. Anyway, you can also see the trench networks here. Anyway, this is a very strong defense. The Ukrainians have been able to basically prevent the Russians from advancing in the Seversk direction from the east. However, the south has had more success. But the Russians are now activated or at least maybe there's just some positional battles. Maybe it's just like some small positional places to get a better view over Bilogorivka. But anyway, so that was this place right here. So the Russians are still pushing Seversk, trying to prevent the Ukrainians from sending reinforcements from this direction. In the Bakhmut front, there's been some changes here. Now, in the northern part of Bakhmut, which we've been talking about for a while, there's actually not been really that much changes. The front line is still more or less where it is. The fights are basically going on over Bogdanovka, and the Russians are not going to be able to take the center part of Bogdanovka until the hills to the west and east of Bogdanovka are taken. That means taking this line right here. It means taking the Popovsky forest here. It means taking this forest right here. And if these places fall, only then can the Russians take Bogdanovka. But since the village is basically a no man's land until the Russians are able to take the hills in the east and west. So there's been kind of a bit of a stalemate here, so we'll see if the Russians are able to break it and take those hills. Speaking of hills, the Russians are actually expanding upon their operations in the north of Klishevka. As I mentioned, there's various hills here that the Russians need to take Klishevka. Klishevka is kind of the same thing with Bogdanovka. The battle is for the hills on the outskirts of the village, not necessarily in the village itself. So in this part, the Russians have managed to basically mostly take this hill right here, and are now advancing. There's been some geolocated footage of the Ukrainians attacking Russian positions here. So the Russians are basically expanding upon their positions, after they took the Bakhmut airport here and these dachas here and reached the outskirts of Ivanivska. Taking this kind of mostly helps Ivanivska more than it helps Russian troops take Klishevka. But, this is another point that will help Russians expand their bridgehead to continue basically reaching the Seversky Donetsk Canal and basically force the Ukrainians back from Klishevka and Avdiivka. So the Russians made some gains in taking this hill right here. But, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, like taking this hill right here, taking this hill right here. That needs to be done in order for Klishevka to fall, and by extension, then Avdiivka. And then the Ukrainians will have to be forced back to this canal. So the Russians are still on the offensive in Bakhmut, but small gains, but still nothing too big that are to mention. On other areas of the front, in the South Donetsk area, as they call it, there's been no changes. The Russian troops are having a very hard time in trying to take Novomikhailivka here. It's they've been trying to they have not been able to advance directly into it, and the advances to the fields are ongoing, but nothing has actually changed this week in terms of progress that would expand upon Russian opportunities to take that village. I've already discussed in detail the whole purpose of this, so I won't reiterate of this offensive in South Donetsk, so I won't reiterate it. Marinka is still, the Russians are still on the offensive. They're basically trying to reach the center of Grigorivka right here as they advance along this reservoir here. So, and they're also trying to take this hill located right here so they could reach this reservoir right here. So, clash is still ongoing, but no changes in Marinka or South Donetsk. Nothing in Ugledar, nothing in this area right here. Let us talk about Zaporozhye and Kherson now, the last parts of the front for this week. The Russians are still on the offensive in Zaporozhye. They're advancing. They took another tree line to the west of Robotyne here, and basically the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to their gains. They're basically trying to, from the looks of it looks like the Ukrainians are trying to basically hold Robotyne and have some sort of basic defense line. They realize their forward positions, trying to take Novopropovka and Verbova, were unsuitable, but it doesn't look like they're going to give up this entire bridgehead and go back to where they were. They want to keep some sort of gains, and I feel like losing Robotyne is more of a symbolic thing because it was the only gain they had in this direction, which was the main direction for their entire summer campaign. So they wanted to hold Robotyne. They want to hold these fields here. They're just withdrawing from like these forward positions here. But the Ukrainians, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to give up this without a fight. But the Russians are pushing, so we'll see if they're able to actually force the Ukrainians out of Robotyne soon. But that is basically it. Kherson, no changes. Krinky is basically there's about 100 Ukrainian Marines that hold it at every time. This kind of small bridgehead, and the Russians bombed them, droned them. So the Ukrainians have a very small presence, and in a vacuum, the Russians are able to go in and just kill them all. But the Ukrainians are very strong in artillery, very strong in drones, very strong in electronic warfare. So any Russian push into Krinky basically leads to a lot of unnecessary Russian losses. So basically, the Russians have basically just been able to turn Krinky into just the Ukrainians keep sending their Marine troops here to get bombed and destroyed and then replaced with more meat for no real gain for the Ukrainians. And not only that, the Ukrainians trying to keep this bridgehead alive has led to a lot of Ukrainian artillery on this bank of the Dnieper River being destroyed. Yes, it is kind of sad that the Russians are not able to liquidate this bridgehead, but also it's like, what's the whole purpose of losing your elite Marine brigades to try to hold, a small slice of a small village? We'll see, but this village is basically done for and will be taken back eventually. So that's the updates on the ground for this week. The Russians' main push is in Avdiivka. The Russians are still trying to find a way to reach the Oskol River and Kupiansk and Liman. The Russians are trying to reach the Seversky Donetsk Canal in Bakhmut, and I've termed this the Russian winter push, because this is the Russians trying to reach, during this winter period, expand their tactical successes. Again, any sort of gains in any sort of gains in any offense. There's not going to be a big arrow offensive. A lot of people are thinking, there's going to be some big Russian push that just sweeps all the Ukrainians all the way to the Dnieper River, or something like that. That's not what's going to happen. What this war shows is that it's going to be it's basically improving your tactical positioning on the ground, and also to attrition the other side. That is the only way. That's how this works. This is World War I, and if you're expecting some big breakthrough, you are in for a rude awakening. However, again, this won't go on forever. You can't just keep up these operations for such a long time. So This war will, again, attrition favors the Russian side just because it is so much more bigger than Ukraine, and so I expect the Ukrainians maybe to survive up until 2026. So, but again, there's so many factors that go into that. Like, how much can Ukraine survive attrition? How much manpower are they getting and replacing, and how much equipment are they getting and losing? How much, so there's just a lot of, what about the Russians? And so this just gives a lot of things to think about when it comes to, like, in terms of, give us a value number on when the Ukrainians will lose, but in terms of from attrition, and so that I can't put a firm, like I said, 2026 just based on my estimates, but I'm not saying that's when it's going to happen. That's just my guess until when the Ukrainians will start losing manpower, or at least losing enough where they'll start losing large chunks of the front. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Like this video if you really like this video, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see videos like this one, and share this video around and comment your thoughts. So aim high and wander on.